All right. What?
Oh gosh, I think it's
Okay,
playing
it's the
first.
recording. Okay, thank you. Let me start to screen share first. Boom, and it's that typical lag, and right here. So, topic today is stop doing this mouse. Sorry, my mouse is being weird. There you go. So, topic today just so happens to be is singleness a gift? And if you're thinking, why am I suddenly taking a beeline to this topic? It's actually quite related to our previous two. So hopefully, as we move forward, you guys don't forget the foundation, our first session on this topic, and then of course our second session, how men and how men and women image God, and how the norms between them play out. So, the question, as you often know, is singleness truly a gift? Right? You've read the title, but I'm not even gonna be everyone's bubble immediately right now. It's the fact that singleness is actually not a gift; it is an affliction. Okay. Now you may ask, well, how do we define gifts and afflictions at all? Then, because every Christian who believes God, right, especially who believes in a God who is sovereign, should believe that all things are from God in one way or another, even a season of singleness, even a spouse. So that's true, which is why we need more specific context when we're talking about marriage and singleness and all these things. So, in a broad context, gifts are things that God has given and has declared to be explicitly good indeed, right? So think about all the divisions God made during Genesis. When He made the heavens and the earth, He divided the moon and the sun, He divided the sea and the land. He said that it was all good. And then when He reaches man, that's when uh, He said the first thing that was not good. God said it is not good for man to be alone. So that's how we would define gifts and afflictions. But again, before getting too much into it, let's take a real clear example from passages, right? So let me move your guys' face aside first because I can't see my own slide. And yeah, so how shall we define gifts and afflictions? I'm a bit redundant on the slide there, but it's fine. So, first of all, take a look at Isaiah 25, verse 6. He says, on this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well aged wine, of rich food, full of marrow, of aged wine, well refined. So, for a little bit of context, Isaiah 25 talks about God in his deliverance, right? He just finished judging the world. He judged Ephraim and Edom and all these other nations. And then he saves his people. And then he then proceeds to reward his people with the finest meats and the choicest wines, right? So guess what? Immediately we can tell that meat and wine, dare I say alcoholic wine, are good gifts from God. So sorry for all the Baptists out there. Alcoholic wine is a gift from God, and to call wine drinking a sin would be a bit too far of a stretch. Now, again, these are good gifts. Why? Because God Himself has given to His people not as a punishment, but for a celebration, right? Another example is James 1:17. Sorry, there's a box there because I accidentally pressed outline. But James 1:17, which says that every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Now, it's funny because many New Testament theologian and even reader are very dismissive of the Epistle of James, right? If you guys know, even Martin Luther himself once was also dismissive of the Epistle of James because he thought, James never really touched upon the gospel. But what if I tell you that this very passage later became the inspiration for John's gospel, right? Some say John is the most profound New Testament writer, which is weird because they dismiss James as a New Testament writer. But here's the language, right? Notice the language in James 1:17 is later then adopted when John writes his gospel account. In, for example, John 6:33, for the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. So the language, how to say, the language in James 1:17 is adopted by John. It's not talking about any benevolent gifts, right? So many people would interpret James 1:17 as, oh, it's every gift that God gives, both to believers and non-believers alike, conversations, friends, families, all these things. But that's actually not true. So if you read properly and you interpret properly, uh, in a sense, it speaks of a gift, a singular gift, right? I know it says every, but in the Greek, the gift itself is singular, that comes down from the Father of lights. Well, think again, John chapter 6, Jesus talks about himself as a bread that comes down from above, right? Verse 33 literally says, for the bread of God is the one who comes down from heaven, gives life into the world. Another example, John 8, where he says to the Pharisees, I am from above, you are from below. John chapter 4, he says to the Samaritan woman, if you knew the gift of God, referring to himself, that comes down from heaven. And so John takes this proto-Johannine vocabulary that actually comes from the Epistle of James and uses it to refer to Jesus Christ as the gift that comes down from heaven time and time again. And so what is James and John referring to? It's clear. You have to interpret James 1 and all the passages in John Christologically, right? It refers to the fact that Christ has come and that salvation is a gift to the poor, not a reward for the righteous. So salvation is also a gift according to scripture, right? It's a good thing that God gives to his people to be accepted, not to be denied and not to be earned, because it's not a reward, it's not a payoff, it's not a payday, it's a gift. Now, if that's the case, then so are these other examples that I'm going to point to for marriage, spouse, and children. Proverbs 18, verse 22 says, he who finds a wife finds a good thing and even obtains favor from the Lord. Another one is Psalm 127, verse 45. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate. So spouse and children, meaning not only the marriage itself as a gift, but fruitful marriages, right? Marriages with many children are also gifts from God. And the one who finds them even obtains favor from the Lord. So another quick example is in Exodus, right? So both in Exodus and Deuteronomy, but I'm just going to quote Exodus here. It states that if Israel maintains covenant faithfulness, then there will be blessings from God's covenant, which is in Deuteronomy 31, but also in Exodus 23, verse 26, whereby God says, there shall be no one miscarrying or barren in your land. I will fulfill the number of your days. So partly in that, fruitfulness, right? Miscarriage is not good and barrenness is not good. And so what's the good gift? The fact that God will make sure no one in their numbers, no one in their people are miscarried or barren, and that their age will be long in the land, which is exactly in one of the commandments. So remember, we talked about in the Old Testament how there is, if you remember back in session 1, we talked about how in the Old Testament, there is no instance of demon possession anywhere. Meanwhile, when we move forward to New Testament Israel, demon possession was like catching common cold. Well, and that just kind of shows how much Israel is taken over by the devil. Well, yesterday, I was having a book club reading the Institutes of Biblical Law. And guess what? We were thinking and we were counting which book in the Bible had the most instance of poverty, widows, deaths among children specifically. It's undeniable that the Gospels is, right? The Gospels are full of instances where children's dying. There's many widows, there's many sick orphans, and especially poverty. So even the book Ruth, right, in the Old Testament, Ruth was literally centered on a broken household, on a poverty household. And yet the whole book of Ruth would not defeat the Gospels in terms of poverty content. So by the time of the New Testament, Israel had become covenantally unfaithful, and God does not preserve their life nor their young. So on the opposite end, Scripture then calls barrenness, widows, unfruitfulness, and childlessness and miscarriage as curse and affliction. Example, Hosea 9, verse 11, Ephraim's glory shall fly away like a bird. No birth, no pregnancy, no conception. So notice that. Ephraim's glory, this is a glorious thing. That means birth, pregnancy, conception. Those are glorious things. God takes it away. They shall fly away like a bird, and therefore in Ephraim there shall be no birth, no pregnancy, no conception. Verse 14 says, give them, O Lord, what will you give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts. You don't need me to tell you that that's not exactly a good thing. Proverbs puts it this way in Proverbs 15b to 16. Proverbs 30 verse 15b to 16. There are three things that will not be satisfied, four that will not say enough: Sheol, the barren womb, earth that is never satisfied with water, and fire that never says enough. So there it is again. You can see how the Hebrews use an example of how they relate the womb to the earth, right? We talked about that last week, where the womb and the earth is related. But it talks about it in this manner, that a barren womb is like an earth that is never satisfied with water. And so that's how Proverbs would put it. Now, this is true even in the narratives of Scripture. So if you take a look at the individual narratives in Scripture, for example, Genesis 30, right? Rachel, who was not able to give birth, she says, give me children or else I die. It's kind of an extreme expression, but actually, biblically, that's a normal expression. It's just nowadays that people who are barren go saying, and that's perfectly fine. That the culture today is weird, not the Bible. Rachel is being perfectly normal when she's mourning the fact that she is barren. Rebecca also prayed to have her womb open, right? And so did Hannah. Basically, all these women did not rejoice as if unfruitfulness is a gift. They mourn, right? They ask God to make them fruitful, and that's because what children's are indeed. Children's are indeed a blessing, as Psalm 127 says. So yes, barrenness and childlessness, sorry, my bad. So yes, barrenness, childlessness, all these things, these are afflictions. They do not invalidate your personhood. Okay, I'm not, it doesn't prevent your salvation. It doesn't prevent you, stop you from having the ability to serve God with gladness, right? That's not impossible just because you're barren or childless or single. And my presentation is not to make every childless couple or every singles out there feel bad. But I refuse, essentially, to normalize what God clearly says is an affliction, and even go so far as to say, actually, it's a gift, right? It's a gift worth pursuing. Just, that's not true. Because we've seen, again, with the biblical motive, that it is something that is clearly called an affliction or a curse. It is something that if God inflicts, it's an affliction or even a curse at times. So just because some people's feelings will get hurt. Oh, what about all the singles? What about all the single mothers or all the childless parents? That's not the point. The point is biblical norm demands that fruitfulness is the norm and unfruitfulness is the abnormal. So when God creates you with normal desires, right? One which is to be fruitful, multiply, just like the creation mandate, right? Fulfill as the creation mandate demands. That's a good thing. When God gives you that desire, that's a good thing. But when God prevents you from fulfilling and enjoying that good gift, right? Then it's a cause for lament and prayer. Not to put on a brave face, right? Be a stoic and then pretend that it's a blessing. That's not what God wants you to do. I've always thought if you join our Monday prayer nights, as we read through the Psalm, I will always teach the people to pray, as we pray, not to be like Stoics, right? Not to pray with a pretentious kind of piety, saying, "Oh Lord, if it be Thy will, I don't really care if you don't answer my prayer." Not like that, but we are to pray like the psalmist. We are to pray with a kind of godly urgency, a kind of godly impatience, right? Lord, I'm your servant. Do not tarry. Hear my prayers now. Deliver me from this time of trouble, right? And if God answers you, and if God doesn't answer you, then you pray again, right? You don't grumble. You don't put on a brave face saying, "Oh yeah, whatever. I don't need God to answer it anyway." You go, "No, I need to pray again. I need to pray as if my life depends on it," because that's exactly what prayer is. Your life does depend on God's sovereignty. So again, because singleness and barrenness is an affliction, doesn't necessarily mean that a single or someone who is barren is under a curse. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that God hates you or is punishing you. Neither does it mean that it will not become a blessing to you. So I'll talk about that later. But it simply means that our Father in heaven has afflicted you with something abnormal, right? In order to work it for your good and for the good of all his children. That's the point of Romans 8:28, right? That all things, be it good or bad, right, blessing or affliction, will work out for those that loves him. So that's part of his uh, sovereignty. That's the part of his dealing out. But our job is not to find out his secret will, his secret plan, but our job is to obey his word. If his word says that it's a norm, fruitfulness is the norm, then we obey the norm, not encourage people to pursue the abnormal. So that gets us to the modern evangelical conception. And by that, I mean what churches nowadays often teach. So what's the modern evangelical conception? Here's a quote from the Gospel Coalition, an article titled "Dignity of Singleness." So the quote goes, "The gift of singleness reminds us that Jesus is enough and nothing else can truly satisfy." That's what they say. In the article, they also argue that if we imply that singles are not the norm, we rob them of their dignity. So what I did just now, right? I just denied that singleness is the norm. I said it's an abnormality, it's an affliction even at times. I am robbing singles of their dignity. So anyone who's single out here, apparently, according to Gospel Coalition, I'm robbing your dignity. Well, let's follow along. They also argue that 1 Corinthians 7, verse 7 to 8, 7 to 8, and 26 to 31 is Paul saying, in general, he'd rather have more singles in Corinth. So they don't go deep into the text. They just quote the passage and then says that Paul is saying, in general, he'd rather have more singles in Corinth. You can check the article yourself. It's still up. And then they will also say that we should not present marriage as a graduation from singleness. This I would agree. Like I said, marriage is not a graduation from singleness. It's completely opposite. Singleness is another state. Marriage is another state. One I would call a gift. One is a state that can either be an affliction or a blessing, depending, but not something I would tell people to pursue. So moving on, they say things like, and I quote, this is another article that they have. I'm not particularly sure why the article picture is a long spoon and a shorter spoon. Maybe their multimedia department isn't as creative as ours. A shout out to multimedia team. But in this article, they argue and say things like, if marriage shows us the shape of the gospel, right, singleness shows us its sufficiency, right? Another thing that they quote is, sex is simply a signpost, and essentially, when we get to heaven, there is no sex. They would say that, oh, there is no giving and there is no marrying and giving in marriage, and therefore sex is simply a signpost. When the full things come, we would forget about it. We would forget about our gender, our sexuality, and move on accordingly. Well, again, this is, let me go back on my note. So yeah, they imply that in heaven we'll be androgynous spirit beings. We won't be male and female anymore. They say things like, if marriage shows us the shape of the gospel, singleness shows us its sufficiency. And let's be honest, right? if that's the case, if that's what it takes for someone to make a doctrine of singleness, right, then I can do the same. Right? Everyone can make a hot, quotable one-liner that sounds holy, that sounds pietistic, doesn't it? Uh, doesn't it sound pietistic to say, be content in singleness, not in marriage, right? Or even rejoice in the gift of singleness, or denounce the idol of marriage, right? That sounds holy. That sounds pietistic, doesn't it? Well, guess what? Everyone can make that kind of crappy, memorable quote. But here's the thing. All their sentiment are simply scubalon, as Paul would say it. They are simply trash. They are low-grade, demeaning nonsense, and it's a product of either bad or dishonest exegesis. So I point you to my counter thesis that I gave in our first session. If you remember, if you joined us from the beginning of our session on sexuality, then you would remember the thesis, how I relate marriage and sexuality to the gospel, right? And if I have to relate the gospel with marriage and sexuality, it's this, that God the Father arranged for his divine son to marry a prostitute, right? And how that very prostitute became the virgin bride of Christ. So this is the gospel, right? The gospel as the message preached, or as Paul presents it in Ephesians 2, that while we were still rebellious sinners, Christ died for the ungodly, right? He died so that we in our sins can die with him. He lived a perfect life, a life that we're supposed to live but cannot, and so that his righteousness will be imputed to us. And he was resurrected so that the sinners who believe in him and did not rely on the good works, not rely on their own good works, can be resurrected by him. Now, he came, Christ came, he suffered the suffering that we should have suffered, and ultimately, not us, but Christ is the one who makes us righteous, right? Christ is the one who justifies. We don't make ourselves righteous. Christ is the one who makes us righteous. Now, so this is the gospel as it relates to marriage and sexuality. Christ came to save, and not only to save, but he came to save by marriage. And the one detail that the prim and pharisaical people overlook is the fact that the bride of Christ must be unworthy, right? She must have a sordid past. Christ did not come to marry a goody two-shoes princess. He came, suffered, died, rose again for a harlot, because ultimately it is Christ who washes her, who sanctifies her, who makes her the church, the virgin bride of Christ, right? No amount of sexual chastity, no amount of sexual chasteness, and no amount of contentment in being a divorced harlot will ever return her virginity. Just like how no amount of good works will ever wash away your sin. So the church is built up of sinners. It has always been made of sinners saved by grace. So it was a harlot from the beginning, and only Christ can make her a virgin once more. She got no value. She is not a virgin. She is ugly. She is the most undesirable thing in the face of God. And the only way she could ever be given in marriage is because Christ washes her and presents her to himself in marriage, right? So I was reading G.K. Chesterton's book. It's a book called Orthodoxy. Inside the book, there's a quote, and the quote later became an inspiration for the Disney version of Beauty and the Beast, right? But the quote goes like this. G.K. Chesterton, in his book Orthodoxy, said that a thing must be loved before it is lovable, right? Remember, G.K. Chesterton, he was mainly Catholic, but the reason I'm quoting him is not because I agree with Catholics, but mainly because in this part, he is true. That a thing must be loved before it is lovable. To put it in a biblical way, well, 1 John 4:19. We love him because he first loved us, isn't it? We hate God before we were saved, right? The church was a harlot before she was washed. Essentially, it is Christ that came, Christ that washed, Christ that gives us a new heart and a new mind. And therefore, we can be content with Christ because he takes us as his own bride. So, in the sense, I'm contrasting the view that the Gospel Coalition has with my thesis. Is it really true that the sufficiency of the gospel is portrayed by singleness? That's a questionable exegesis, because again, I would say that marriage is central to God's salvation. Christ came to save via marriage. The very fact that the covenant itself was used to describe God's relationship with the church is not something to be ignored. We say it left and right, but the question is, do we really mean it? Do we really mean when we say that the church is the bride of Christ? So again, I don't wish to make this presentation any more polemical than it already is. So let's establish biblical patterns. Now, let's establish biblical patterns of creation and find where the error is in exegesis. Remember, I said just now that their exegesis of 1 Corinthians 7 was a poor one. So we need to examine that passage later. And of course, establish a pattern of creation for ourselves. That would be biblical. So patterns of creation, here's the idea, right? God has built norms. Okay, it's not the fact that here is everything, here's the whole world, you guys do whatever it is that you please. In some sense, we are to enjoy the world. But here's the question, how does someone enjoy the world? Well, God defines it, right? God made the world. He's the one that defines how norms should work, how humans should enjoy the world. And so God has built norms into creation that includes things like our human sexuality. And from last week, right, we were able to find how a man biblically images God, how a woman biblically images God. So I'll infer from our previous session 3 particular patterns in creation, which are the norm. And these norms are first, the norm of men bearing authority via rulership, right? The norm of men and women becoming one flesh, right? The norm of men and women as beneficiaries of each other via marriage. And finally, the norm of women being fruitful. And that is men as beneficiaries of women via children. Now, someone would ask, why am I laying it out in this specific pattern? Right? Why in this pattern, women benefits men and women benefits from each other, and then men benefits from women via children. Why this logic? Why this pattern? Simply because this is the biblical logic that, well, I'll touch on right now. And that logic is followed by Paul twice. So this is the first passage that I'll read. Sorry, I need to get your guys' face away from my slide so I can read. Please go away. Thank you. So 1 Corinthians 11, verse 8 to 12, he says, for a man was not made for woman, but woman from man. Right? Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels and universal head covering. I'm not going to touch on that. We can, one point. But verse 11, nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of women. And all things are from God. So this is one logic Paul gives. Another one, he does so again in 1 Timothy 2, verse 12 to 15, whereby he says, I do not, dang it, sorry, your guys' face keep getting on the way. How do I do this? Real quick. Okay. He says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. Verse 13, for Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. And yet, she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. So notice how Paul's argument mimics one another here. He talks about the man being made not from the woman, but the woman from the man. And then, of course, that results in many things that Paul says. One is that she should not exercise authority, meaning the men should, and that the women would be saved in childbearing. So just to go through real quick, because we're not going to spend the whole evening trying to interpret that. But again, the norm is men bearing authority, women benefiting from male rulership, and then male and female benefit each other in marriage, right? If you remember our last week's session, the men form and the women fill. So this is how men and women help each other. It's not that Adam needs help subduing. Adam is completely able to subdue and rule by himself. What he cannot do, however, is to fill, right? Adam cannot give birth. Adam cannot fill the area that he has subdued. And so the women are given that task. Adam is given to subdue and women are given to fill. And so now men and women are born through the woman, right? All of mankind is now born through the women. And so if, by the way, if anyone is confused with that last part in 1 Timothy 15, 1 Timothy 2:15, it is mimicking Genesis 3:15, where it says, and I can read it real quick, yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in love and holiness with self-control. So again, the idea is not that women will be saved again by because she gave birth, right? It's not that women who don't give birth are not saved, but it's mimicking the language in Genesis 3:15, whereby all of mankind ultimately will be saved through a childbirth, right? This one child who is going to be born, which is the seed of the woman, who will crush the seed of the serpent. That's Jesus Christ. That's the Messiah's birth. So that's the pattern that Paul appeals to twice in the New Testament, right? That men bears authority. That should be the norm. Women should not subvert, but instead benefit from that kind of rulership. And then men are now reliant on women via children. Women are given the infinite privilege and the ability to bear and nurse a child. Again, so moving on. Sorry, let me take a look at my notes. Paul makes it general again by shifting through the plural halfway through the verse, saying if they continue in faith, charity, holiness, with sobriety. So this is the biblical norm. Okay, what happens if we subvert it? Right, we establish a biblical norm, and I borrowed from 2 weeks and last week's session. How do we? We keep it, but what happens if we subvert it? What happens if we deny that? Oh yeah, God has a biblical norm, but I don't want to obey it. Right? The women says, "Oh, I want to overt authority. I want to take over." While the man goes, "You know what? I'm lazy. I don't want to lead. I'm just gonna sit back, relax, take a back seat." What happens? Well, I borrowed some material from a pastor. His name is Non-Tenant. He has some really good points, but his points are a bit belabored. It's a bit complicated. So let me summarize his points. The subversion, there's consequences if you deny God's biblical norms, right? What happens if you subvert the creation pattern? Where eliminating male headship produces sexual confusion in the personal realm, right? Boys don't know how to be men. And then women assume leadership role because the men won't, right? The man goes, "Oh, no, you shouldn't lead." And the man goes, "Okay, fine, then I won't lead." Then the woman will lead. And then the women will become butched by insisting to be included in all the glamorous male roles, right? We see that today. The women want to be all sorts of stuff, pastors, civil governments, soldiers, even CEOs of big companies. But no women wants to be plumber or trash collector, right? That too is an exclusively male vocation. So why does no female want to do that? But again, it's not because it's about equality. It's about subverting the creation pattern. Eventually, the drive for androgyny meaning, there's no distinction. Male and female are the same. A female is actually a man, and a man is actually a female. They're actually the same thing. There's no difference. The drive for androgyny produces the transgender madness we see nowadays, right? This is still June. This is still Pride Month. You still see some of it. People are being proud, saying that, we're not men, we're not women. What are we? We don't really know. There is no God. God didn't make us male, female. We can be whatever we want. And if you think that's just America, then don't worry. I would say if pastors keep on blurring gender distinctions in Malaysia, then we'll catch up in no time. Right? Don't worry about it. It's gonna come around anytime soon. But eliminating marriage, right? That's what happens when you promote singleness and all these things. Eliminating marriage produces licentiousness and disease in the personal realm, right? Church leaders often say that if you're not sexually chaste, then you're not ready for marriage, right? That's what they would say. If you're not sexually chaste, if you're not sexually pure, then you're not ready for marriage. But that's not what Paul said. If anything, Paul said that if singles burn with passion, then it's better for them to get married, right? It is better for you to marry than to burn with passion. And yet, for some reason, people think that these singles, if they kept remaining single, they will obtain that sexual chasteness, that sexual purity. Well, guess what? If you take a look, if you just take a look statistically, real quick, you'll find that 80% of Malaysians' children aged 10 to 17, mind you, the low bar that I set was 10. 80% of those children from 10 to 17 years old, they've watched pornography intentionally. That is an amazing stat for someone born in our age. I don't even have a phone until I was 15. And yet, if I look at the stats of nowadays, children are already watching porn since the age of 10, intentionally. This is from a recent survey I found at MAP. And another one is this. Every 225 out of every 225 out of 4,500 adolescent aged 12 to 19 in Negeri Sembilan only. I did not widen the search categories yet. In Negeri Sembilan only, 225 out of 4,500 have had sexual intercourse outside of marriage. All right? These people, they're singles. They are remaining singles. But guess what? There is no sexual purity. There is no sexual chasteness. There is licentiousness everywhere and disease everywhere. This is why all the STD rates are going up. This is why all the, free sex rates are going up. And so again, the intimacy that's previously reserved for strengthening marital bonds is transformed into and then despised as a casual recreation, right? And some people, for some reason, would say, oh, Marco, there's no connection here. There's no connection of saying singleness is a gift and then we result in, I would deny, because this is you denying the creation norm, right? And look at what we have today. We have an increase in sexual impurity. We have an increase in licentiousness. And that's what I would interpret as Paul saying, people receive the due penalty for their error in the flesh, right? That's partly what Paul is meaning, at least for his day, and I'm going to apply it to our day now, that this is what happens. This is the due penalty, and I'm going to move on because part of it is still worse, that once women become convinced that the ideal for their lives is to pretend being men, right? Once everyone is convinced that you're only a better woman if you try to become men. Right? If you try to become second-rate men, you try to get jobs that men have, you try to gain the status quo of men. Right? Once women are convinced that the ideal of their lives is to pretend being men, and then once everyone is convinced that love is the one that sanctifies sex rather than the marriage covenant, right? By the way, if anyone is considering that, please don't. Love does not sanctify sex, all right? Only the marriage covenant does. So, but people are convinced. People are convinced that love is the one that sanctifies sex, right? No, it's not. The marriage covenant is, but they think that, and the men begin to realize, right? Because the women are becoming second-rate men, both in jobs and both in the sexual market, right? Then guess what? Both sexes begin to resent each other. Both sexes, the male and female, begin to hate each other in this kind of rivalry zero-sum race, right? It's either an all-male market or an all-female market. They are competing with one another instead of fulfilling the creation pattern, which is helping one another fill and form the earth, right? As the creation mandate would have it. And so eliminating female fruitfulness is another problem. So eliminating female fruitfulness produces mental illness in the personal realm and a monstrous industry of child sacrifice in the socio-political realm. What do I mean by that? you might ask. Well, sorry, simple. Once you take out female fruitfulness, right? Once you say, fruitfulness is not really the norm, you can pursue singleness, you can pursue chasteness, whatever. But once you do that, once you eliminate female fruitfulness as the telos, right? You now have sexual intercourse as mere recreation, what I said just now. And the concept of household, right? The concept of household now has become meaningless, has become utterly meaningless. And children are now seen as a handicap, right? We talked about it just now, and I'm not saying in my group I had John, Jackson, and Chen Hong, and I'm not saying that they see children as a burden, but it kind of gets us in that way. It might subvert our thoughts, but to some degree, we start to think, hey, you know what? Children are a handicap, right? A household is meaningless. It is difficult. Children are a handicap. They are not like the gifts and the asset, like the bows in Psalm 1 to 7, right? Psalm 1 to 7 doesn't say that a man would be blessed if he has one really sharp arrow. No, the man is blessed when his quiver is full of them. And yet we don't see that. We see a full quiver, right? Many children as a burden. It's a difficult lifestyle, not one to be encouraged for. So children in our modern age are despised. They are hated. And thanks to modern technology, right, we can dispose of them in the secrecy of the womb, right? Before anyone even has to look at them. In other words, abortion, Plan B pill, whatever you want to call it, etc., all the ways that you can kill a child before their own mother could even see them, right? Interesting, isn't it? Malaysia has had 90,000 babies killed every year, right? This is from the Federation of Reproductive Health Associations, Malaysia, FRHAM. America is about 850,000 per year. So, but here's the thing. This is what the culture says is empowering to women and partly empowering to men, right? This is what they call reproductive right, right? The men have sex, they don't need responsibility. The women have sex, they too don't need to bear the burden of having to bear children for 9 months. All that is taken, and the culture says this is what empowers sex. This is what makes sex lively and vibrant. No consequence, no children. Well, guess what? Interestingly enough, 1.5 billion slain babies later, here we are. Women are mysteriously more empowered than ever, and yet more depressed than ever, while the men are more confused sexually than ever and more effeminate than ever before, right? So, again, some people would say that, does that really make sense? Does eliminating female fruitfulness lead to more abortion and sex out of marriage? Is that really an outlandish idea? Think about it like this. Again, this is part of me going through a book club yesterday, reading the Institutes of Biblical Law, and we're reading about Moloch worship, right? So if you don't know, Moloch or Malik or Malcolm, whatever ways you want to say it, means king, right? Moloch simply means king. So Moloch worship is simply state worship, right? They're worshiping the king, they're worshiping the state. It's a state religion. The state demands everything from the people, from birth to death. And so what do? First of all, they would demand that the priest, right, the priest of Moloch worship, to separate themselves from their humanity, right? So the Moloch worshippers, these pagan worshippers who worship a dead statue, would say, you must separate your humanity. How would you do that? Well, partly self-mutilation. So usually before you become a Moloch priest, you must self-mutilate. And specifically, the part that you mutilate, usually for men, is castration. Supposedly women as well, but for men, specifically, it is castration. That is, again, a denial. They do not want to worship the one true God. And the one true God says that fruitfulness is the norm. So how do they rebel in their religious worship that is against the true God? Simple. They deny their humanity. They deny the biblical norm that fruitfulness is good. They castrate themselves, right? They make themselves eunuchs. in a very real sense. And then what happens? Well, if you don't know, a Moloch statue looks like a bull, right? It looks like a half bull. It has a bull head and it's a body of a human. The statue would have a hand looking like a cradle, and under the statue would be a furnace, right? So they would turn on the furnace, the statue would be molten hot, and their own children, their own babies, would be given to the statue. Their own babies would be given to the cradle of the statue, and they would burn. And then their cries would be covered by the music that the Amalekites are playing. So think about it. Today's abortion, right? Today's free sex and abortion rates, back then, child sacrifice, the fact that they castrate, the fact that men nowadays take on Atrol and all these hormone suppression, how is it not different? This is the same rebellion. This is the same rebellion against God's norm that people have been doing ever since the Old Testament. It's just that now in the New Testament, now in the modern age, we can call it science. We can call it terminating the fetus. And we can call it abstaining from having a family by taking pills and whatnot. Let me warn you, beloved, it is no different than Moloch worship. It is literally quite no different. So essentially, my whole point, if summed up, is this: low view of marriage, low view of fruitfulness, along with the glorification of singleness, produced the death culture that we see today. All the single mothers, all the abortion, the lack of father figures today, they did not come because nobody preached about how to build a biblical household. But it came because the churches first threw away marriage and glorified a curse. They tell people to pursue the curse. Unmarried people are frustrated, right? They come to their church leaders. They say, I'm unmarried, I'm single, and I'm kind of frustrated. I want to get married. But then the church leaders say, oh, it's a gift. You're just not being grateful for your gift. Say thank you for the present, right? And then you're there. You're saying, I opened my Christmas present. It's a sweater. In the back, it's an image of a horse feces. And I'm trying to understand why God would give me a sweater of horse feces. But I'm told to hold it on my chest and say, this is exactly what I want. That helps nobody. That absolutely helps nobody and does nobody any good. If anything, that produced the death culture that we see today. And again, I said this once and I'll say it again, right? The church had women pastors before the world introduced female military units, meaning the church allowed women to fight their spiritual warfare before the world enlisted mothers and daughters to fight actual warfare. And so in the same manner, the church glorified unfruitfulness before the world became a party of death and barrenness. So what then is the true gift, right? Is there really nothing other than marriage and being fruitful? Well, no, there is a true gift, right? And actually, it's not singleness. So I'm going to get on the passage, but nowhere in the Bible says that singleness is a gift. The right question to ask is, do I have the gift of celibacy, right? In other words, has God given you the ability to be a eunuch for the kingdom, and has he called you to do so? So Matthew 19, verse 11 to 12 is the clearest passage we have. Jesus himself teaching it. He said, but he said to them, not everyone can receive this saying, but only to those whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth. There are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this receive it. So eunuch there, people want to interpret it in many ways. Just put it simply as how it's supposed to be translated, right? Eunuch simply means that people who do not have sex drives, right? And that could be done in many ways. Like the passage says, it could be castration or birth defect, right? Or they might have a mastery over their sex drive, right? So much so that it's not a distraction for them, right? This is not a particularly chose, right? This is a gift that's given to God to those who can accept it, meaning they chose to become eunuchs, while some it's given to them since birth. Now, the question is, how many people often have this gift, right? How many people often actually have the gift of celibacy? And I would say in my whole lifetime of ministry, I've known about 2 people who probably has this gift. And that's me speculating because probably secretly they want to be married. It's just that I see that they're not too bothered with the idea. So again, it's not even the norm. The gift of celibacy is still not the norm. If you burn with desire, then singleness is not a gift to you, right? So again, celibacy as an affliction when it's not chosen freely and responsibly, right? When it distracts you from kingdom work, meaning you still desire to marry, you're still bothered about marriage, and you're uh, dying from uncontrolled passion, right? You look at pornography, you have sexual licentiousness, you have multiple sex partners, then you're not gifted, right? Someone in the CF in the past, I'm not gonna say his name, but he once told me, I think I have a gift of celibacy, right? And then I asked him, do you still struggle with porn? He said, yes. And I said, give me a break. That means you don't, right? You don't have the gift of celibacy. And so, again, if you do, you might, again, the idea is you might not be distracted with the desire to marry, but it might become even worse because now you're distracted by all this sexual immorality that clearly you have no control over. So this would bring us to 1 Corinthians 7, right? And I would read it first, although I don't have it on the passage on the screen because it is quite long. But I'm going to focus on some part of the text. I promise I will get through the context. But, there are people who would say that marriage is an idol, right? If you're so fixated on getting married, and that's an idol. So I would call these people marriage is an idol brigade. These people often do 1 Corinthians 7 for their proof text, right? But let me say, oh no, I'm lagging. Okay, hopefully not. No. But yeah, I would say, you might know this quote, and I would say a text without a context is a pretext for a proof text, right? What am I saying? I'm saying these kind of people take 1 Corinthians 7 out of context. So the favorite verses that they often take out of context by, the singleness as a gift advocate would be verse 8, which is to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. They will also take verse 38. So when he who marries is betrothed as well, and he refrains from marriage by judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God, referring to, Paul also being single. So taken out of context, they're quite self-explanatory, right? If you just read them for what they are, singularly, then you might even go, actually, singleness is a better gift than marriage, right? If I just read these ones, it says those who don't marry actually will do even better. But that's, again, a problem because the passage is being used as a proof text at that point. They're not actually trying to find out what it's saying. This is false. So first of all, you have to notice the fact that Paul is speaking about people in times of distress. So verse 26, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 26. And again, I'm hoping you guys turn with me to 1 Corinthians 7 because I don't have the full passage on all the time. It says that in verse 26, I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. So note there that there is clearly a present distress. One of the other translation, the way that NET puts it, it says, because of the impending crisis, I think it best for you to remain as you are. Now, here's the question. Does this sound like an advice for all Christians across all time, for all their lives? Obviously not. Who can expect some kind of imminent persecution? So Paul's concern is that being married increases one's vulnerability to sin when times of catastrophe arise, because it increases the leverage the world can exert against you. Your loyalties easily become divided, right? You need to protect your wife, you need to follow your husband, you need to protect your children, but you also need to protect your faith and follow your Lord. But what happens if the world decides to put that against each other, right? I'm gonna have your children, I'm gonna have your wife, I'm gonna have your husband if you gonna keep your faith, and they put that against one another. So question is, what manner of distress, right? What manner of worldly troubles are these? Aren't Christians always in trouble in some sense? And I would say yes, to some degree, right? Christians are always against the world in a way, but the crisis that's about to come is actually quite brutal. So much so that Paul explicitly explains it in verse 29 to 31. So this is the passage, and I color it the way I do because you need to pay attention to the grammar. And I really need to get rid of this thing. Boom, there you go. So here's the quotation for 29 to 31, the coming crisis. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short, right? The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, right? That's interesting, knowing that Paul wrote Ephesians 6 and Colossians 2, whereby Colossians 3, sorry, whereby he says, love your wife, submit to your husband. Now he's saying, if you have wife, live as if you had none. Those who mourn, as though they were not mourning. Those who rejoice, as though they were not rejoicing. Those who buy, as though they had no goods. And those who deal with the world, as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. Notice that the present form of this world is passing away. So what happens? Well, a bad interpretation would turn the entire history of the church into this present distress, right? If you want to say this is a universal command for all Christians at all times, then all these exhortation that Paul gives will also apply, because this is in the same context that Paul gives the other singleness exhortation. And so the whole history of the church becomes this present distress. These are extreme instructions. Are you kidding me? This goes against Paul's other epistles, which tells us to love our wives, submit to our husbands, disciple our children. But here's the thing, Paul's language here mimics the language of Jesus when he talks about the destruction of the temple. And I would argue, I'm not going to get too much into eschatology here, but exactly the crisis, and it says I'm lagging again, so hopefully I'm not, hopefully I recover from the, and am I? Okay, so hopefully I came back. But yeah, so the crisis here is the same one that Jesus presents in the Olivet Discourse, right? Matthew 24, Luke 17, whereby he says, on that day, let the one who goes, let the one who is on the housetop with his goods in the house not come down. Likewise, let who's in the field not turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Whoever seeks to preserve his life will lose it, but whoever loses life will keep it. I tell you, on that night there will be two in one bed. One will be taken, the other left. There will be two women grinding together. One will be, and it's the same. The abomination of desolation. Then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who is in the housetop do not go take down what's in his house. Let the one who's in the field not go back take his cloak. For the women pregnant in those days, pray that your flight is not in the Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, right? A great crisis, a great tribulation, such as has not been seen from the beginning of the world until now. So let me not belabor the point because I'm running out of time. This is the crisis that Paul is talking about, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And that's why he says the appointed time has grown very short, and that the present form of this world, not this cosmos, okay, this oikoumene, this world order, is about to pass away. So another point, simple points to remember. Sorry, these are the passages. Another simple point to point out is the fact that verse 38 and 40 are directed to people who are already betrothed. Okay, meaning they're already engaged, they're promised in marriage. If this distress is an ongoing normal state of affair for the church, then how does this advice make sense? He's telling those who's already engaged to not break the engagement, mind you, but to stay engaged and not go through with it, right? Paul did not advise that. That's just the logical conclusion. He did not say never get married. He says remain as you are. So the betrothal should not be broken, but be put on hold. And then he proceeds to advise the same thing for fathers considering to give their daughters in marriage. Again, if this advice is supposed to be forever, then it doesn't make sense and even cruel. Right? He's saying fathers should never give their daughter. Hoping I'm not lagging again. Am I lagging again? Hopefully
Quite
not.
severely. Quite severely.
Okay.
Now I think
Coherent?
it's starting.
Sorry.
It's starting to recover.
Okay.
Yeah, I try lah.
But yeah, hopefully you get my point. It's a betrothal. It's not to be broken. And again, the idea is this is not an everlasting advice. This is not a forever. And finally, to make a quick point, Paul ends his advice mimicking the language of Jesus again. So 1 Corinthians 7, 8 to 9, he says to the unmarried, the widows, I say it's good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. While Jesus says, in Matthew, disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. But Jesus, right, he said to them, not everyone can receive the same, but only to those whom it is given. Again, not a norm. This is an advice, clearly, for something that is about to come or is a time of crisis in some way. So to conclude my point, successful and fruitful marriages are the fruits of a godly and blessed culture. It is something that we should wholesale promote and not be embarrassed about. Okay? Christ is the Lord of our assumption. He's the Lord of our sexual assumptions. And so we do not let the world, we do not let the culture define what's the sexual norm. God is the one who defines our sexual norm, right? We sin, we created a world where fruitfulness exists, where we created a world where thorns and thistles exist. Christ came to rescue us from those thorns, thistles, and barrenness. Do not go back to the curse from which he rescued you from. That's going to be my closing point. And so we can, I go a bit over time, which is my bad, but now we can hopefully go into the Q&A. So if I can give it back to you, John.
All right, thank you, Marco. Okay, so now I'll be going to the long form of Q&A. You are free to ask questions that needs addressing, and Marco will reply best of his abilities. Open to the floor. Anyone can ask.
Okay.
Should I just grill you like crazy?
Sorry?
Should I just grill you like crazy?
Kill me.
Okay.
Repeat
Grill
that.
you, grill you, grill you.
I can't.
I like a medium rare, Marco.
Okay, go ahead. Sure.
I guess. Okay. If anyone else has any other questions to ask, please ask right now because I have a ton in my brain.
Feel free to ask.
Yeah.
So while James is trying to serve me up.
I got a question. So in terms of marriage, right? How should we think of it after Christ coming?
After Christ coming, so this is again noticing that Christ came in 70 AD, right? That's not the final coming.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you're talking about the 70 AD or
I'm talking about like the second coming.
Actual coming.
Yeah.
Right? Actual coming. Corporately, we are married, right? Gospel Coalition says that there is no marriage in heaven, but actually there is. Actually,
the marriage between Christ and the
we
church.
enter heaven, right? So, in a very real way, right? I'm not just saying it's just a spiritual thing, because we will be physical, right? We will still be resurrected as male. Right? I will still be a man. You will still be a woman in heaven, but we will not marry. We will not be given in marriage,
Mm.
but we will celebrate a particular marriage,
Mm.
which is between the Lamb and Christ.
Mm.
Sorry,
The Lamb
the Lamb and
his bride.
and his bride.
Mm.
Yeah. How does that work specifically? I can't really tell, to be honest with you, right? Because
Mm.
we're the church.
Mm,
Sorry,
mm.
I'm really lagging, so you can go ahead. Yeah.
So then how should that be interpreted for us who is kind of like in the middle right now? Like we're not at before the first coming of Christ, we are in between.
Yeah. So you're asking how marriage should be looked upon by us in this kind of middle period, is it?
Oh.
Yeah. Like I said, when it should be a gift, a
Mm.
good thing that even reflects the gospel, right? As I said,
Mm.
the fact that we practice and we defend biblical marriage is the fact that we still believe in the hope of the gospel,
Mm.
right? The fact that Christ came for a harlot, for a whore. And so we should defend it. We should pursue it as it truly is depicted, a gift. It's not, it should not be something that people should be embarrassed about, right? Oftentimes churches who preach a lot on marriage, they get scorned. People say, why do you keep preaching about marriage? Why don't you preach about the single people? Well, guess what? You shouldn't stay single for too long. And if you're single, you should go about it by yourself and not burden everyone with it, right? It's meant to be a gift, right? It's meant to be kingdom work. And how about you show that as a kingdom work, as a single person? So, and again, in terms of the new heavens and the new earth, we can't really tell because all we know is that corporately we are the bride, but as a singular person, the bride of Christ, the church is our mother, right? That's what Paul says as well. The church is our mother. So it's not a one-to-one connection. We have to realize there's a corporate sense, spiritually and physically as well, that the church is us, but also that the church is our mother, and we'll get to enjoy that wedding ceremony in heaven, essentially. So hopefully that answers your question.
Anyone else?
Is it?
Does
If
it
so,
help,
then
Colette?
James can. Yeah. Anyone else or James?
Yeah. Otherwise, I'm rapid firing now.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. Okay. You have talked deeply mostly about the physical aspects, I believe. Mostly speaking, mostly physical aspects.
Uh-huh.
I asked most of these questions out of partly mostly the benefit of others.
Okay.
What spiritual benefit does
Benefits.
marriage?
Okay.
What spiritual benefits does marriage grant to the person? To each person,
Uh,
of course.
First of all, again, it's the idea. Here's the part where the church mixes it, right? For some reason, Paul says it is better to be married than to burn with passion. What can we infer from Paul saying that? Paul is actually saying marriage can sanctify you, right?
Okay.
Marriage can sanctify you in terms of your burning passion, your sexuality. The churches decide to do 180 on that, whereby they say, here's purity culture, achieve this, then you deserve marriage. Again, that goes against the shape of the gospel. The shape of the gospel is Christ came exactly for an unworthy bride, right? That marriage is for an unworthy whore. But the purity culture, the problem that I see is that they say, no, you gotta deserve marriage now. If I'm not trying to make a heretical parallel, it's almost like saying you gotta work, you gotta be sexually pure for Christ to marry you, right? You gotta be holy for Christ to save you. That doesn't work. See, so I would have to go so far as to say the spiritual benefits of marriage is teleological. It almost resembles the fact that the gospel sanctifies. Right? It almost mimics the way the gospel sanctifies us as Christians in general. And part of that is it sanctifies us in our sexual impurity.
Mm.
So that's
Okay,
one of my answer.
that's fair. All right. All right. Then would the given given the attitudes that you were speaking about in terms of children and so on,
Mhm.
this is a hot button issue because a lot of people, a lot of those in the country are now probably pushing for what more sexual education and all these kind of things,
Right. Yeah.
which would entail something like contraception or something. So
Right.
would
Mhm.
would the question does then come up whereby is contraception necessarily a sin on this in this respect in terms of our attitude towards marriage and children? You're freezing.
A
You're
lot of
freezing.
church, like a
Yeah.
lot of. Sorry, am
No,
I
you were
still freezing?
lagging. Now you're
Okay.
okay now.
Okay. I'm okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of Christians, a lot of Christian leaders, a lot that I respect, obviously, are divided on the issue, right? But most people would say they would press on, right? Why would you have contraceptive, or why would you prevent marriage? Right? Sorry, basically prevent having children, right? But mostly, we're gonna be hostile to the idea, and that's not a kind of fundamentalistic, oh, contraception absolutely never even in hell, never even in an ideal world. uh, I don't think that's the idea. I think the idea is that yes, children are always a gift. Sorry, they're not always a gift. They're a gift if you're covenantally faithful, right? If you raise them properly, and therefore as a Christian, you should strive for children and discipling them properly. And the question becomes, why would you have contraception? Why would you delay that? People would say, oh, it's money, it's ability, it's this or that. And I would say, well, if that's the problem, right? If you're afraid of the consequence of having sex, then maybe you shouldn't have sex yet, right? Because that's what one of the problem I just pointed to, the fact
Yeah.
that when you take the consequence of a sexual intercourse, you produce all manner of uh, child sacrifice. I have to say,
Yeah.
all manner of mental illness and child sacrifice in the socio-political realm. So
Yeah. Bearing in mind that it was one.
contraceptives really hostile. Sorry, yeah. Contraceptives, I'm really hostile to it, but I would press on further to ask, why would you want contraceptives?
Bearing in mind that once upon a time the church did basically say that contraceptives are sin.
Right.
The Anglican Church changed its stance on it, but
Right. So
Church of
I
England
think
sort of thing.
they should have been a bit more strict, right? I would say it's 90% of context a sin.
Right.
So,
I'm losing.
but yeah,
I'm losing all the memories of what other questions I had. But, oh, well.
yeah, sure. Any question, or if anyone else had any questions, or maybe everyone is just like, yeah, I'm on board with marriage. I, I know Chunchung is, because Chunchung is married. So I hope Chunchung is on my side. For that.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I mean, right, but I mean, just a bit on the contracept. I mean, birth control. I rather use the word birth or family planning, whatever you call it. I think
Mhm.
right now we are living in a world that is very different from the past. Last time
Mm.
you have a lot of children because children die. They are delicate. They die easily. You can read about it. When missionaries have 10 children, 7 of them died. And it's very common,
Yeah.
you know.
Mm-hmm.
But now we have another problem that we have to think about is people live longer. And
Mhm.
if you have uncontrolled, you have 10 children, the reality is that how are you going to
Mhm.
raise 10 children? You know, I mean, that is a reality. I don't think you want to, if you get married young, you are you have sex all the time and you end up with 10 kids. Living in the city, not in the rural areas, how are you going to raise them? I think that is something that I think we need to think hard about. Because I think calling birth control a sin, I will not say that, but not seeing children as a gift is also something that's totally unbiblical, because children are a gift. You know, I have a daughter who passed away, and it's very dear to me. But also in terms of what we need to think about, that we live in a very different time, and so but I agree, and so it's just that there's a lot more to think about, and not just label it and say that that birth control, you know, is something that is not allowed. Yeah, but we have to think deeper on this issue as well. Yeah, just a comment on that.
On the 10 children's one, I'm told that it gets easier. I told it get easier.
But yeah, it's something that's difficult, but as difficult as it is, it's something that we must consider, right? I would say that if someone is capable, financially, technically, and even wants to have 10 children, I say they should, and they should raise them up all as worshippers, right? Again, that's assuming that they're responsible, they made the decision, and they're willing to go through with it as they should, as responsible parents, right? However many children you have, you must go through with it, and it must be properly done. Another question is, since marriage is the norm, for a case where one is widowed, should they be married again? According to Paul, it seems that there is no need to remarry, but why? The need to remarry again, remember the context of 1 Corinthians 7, right? The fact that a present distress is coming, right? So for the widows, he's saying, for the widows, remain as you are, remain widowed. In the Old Testament, the widows are exhorted to marry again, right? Think of example, Ruth and Boaz, right? And Ruth's mother or Ruth's mother-in-law. So why is that? Because again, women are the beneficiaries of male rulership. What's a widow, right? A widow doesn't have a brother. The brother has already gone away, build a household of his own. She doesn't have a father, right? She has no head, right? A widow is literally someone who has no head. Husband's dead, father's gone, brother is probably gone. And so she does not benefit from the normal creational pattern. She is, in a very real sense, not safe physically and spiritually. And so that's why in the Old Testament laws, the brother of the widow's husband, right? The widow's husband is dead. His brother should at least pay for her, right? Pay for her dowry, her basically her needs, her food, her settlement, all these things. And again, I think Christians should. I'm not saying that, you know, if your brother dies, you gotta take care strictly like that. No, I think the church should support to some degree, right? I think the church community should come together and say, here we have widows, clearly. And that's what Paul is saying, right? That's what Paul rebukes some of the churches for. Hey, you're not caring about the widows. Here's the widows. They have zero protection. They have no head. You gotta take care of them. And that's how I would say is the way we should proceed. I think if someone is widowed and she's still in her early years and she has many children, I would really suggest she gets remarried. But again, lots of considerations to make. I really think wisely enough, she should still be the beneficiaries of male rulership. The church cannot replace that, yeah? The church cannot replace the role of the husband. That sphere is no go. The sphere of the church is here. The sphere of the family is here. So we can get into Kuyperian theology soon. But okay, another question from Mingrong. We can keep going for a bit, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Let me clarify. The distress here means the destruction of the temple and the persecution. Yeah, right? So again, mimic Jesus' language. He says, those in the housetop don't go down. Those in the fields don't go back to take what's in his house. And essentially, those in Judea flee to the mountains. That mimics Paul's language, right? Those who mourn don't mourn. Those who rejoice don't rejoice. And it's essentially, Paul is essentially alluding to the present distress, the soon coming distress. And I still believe that's the 70 AD, because that's not a universal advice. Like I argued just now, would you advise anyone to say, hey, I'm engaged, and then you go, oh, you're engaged, stay engaged forever? This is universally an advice. Just stay engaged until you die. Right? That's not the case. It's not a one-stop shop kind of advice. Paul clearly says, here's a present distress, guys. I don't have a word from the Lord, but I have a very clear advice. If you get married, you might have troubles, right? If you get married, the world's going to exert that force on you. So that I would say is the idea. The fact that the Christians are going to get persecuted when 70 AD happens, but most of them would run away, right? So most of them would believe Jesus and run to the mountains. And that's why they're still Christians nowadays, because they obey Jesus and ran away from the troubles. Yes, 1 Corinthians 7 is the distress there is talking about the destruction of the temple and the persecution.
May I just
Yeah.
let's just talk about something that I think is prevalent but not particularly addressed.
Okay.
I think it's a very Chinese thing right now also, especially. We are
Chinese,
all
okay.
living in an age where we're all delaying marriage, isn't it?
Right. Uh-huh.
That's hardly touched on. So
Mm.
the question that the question then ends up bringing, for those who are technically in relationships or whatever, I have a strong feeling that nowadays people's having longer and longer relationships and delaying marriage longer and longer
Right.
as period
Yeah.
goes. So the question is that, is this even a good thing at this point? Like, for on the
Yeah.
part of the church, and I on the part of Christians, and I think it's also because everyone's like, we live in the city, everything's expensive, so on and so forth. Whereas when you look at people places like Sabah and Sarawak, they're marrying much earlier than any of
Right.
us. And
Yeah.
not only that,
That's, yeah.
in
Go ahead.
America,
Yeah.
people are marrying pretty early, and 22 is considered late. I'm 22, dude.
Yeah.
Like in America and
So
so on, you know.
there's actually a really interesting correlation they studied, right? About 3 generations before, right? So around 70s and 80s, people were marrying about 23s, right? If the women are 23, the men is about 25. And as we go through the Enlightenment, right, as we go through 1980s and so on, suddenly the age goes further and further. And I would have to say that it is the product of the Enlightenment, right? It's the product of the Enlightenment. Productivity back in the biblical times is in the house, right? The husband is the one who goes out, finds productivity, brings it back to the home. And if you think about the Proverbs 31 woman, she is successful, right? She is a successful entrepreneur, but where is her enterprise? Her enterprise is in her homes, right? As her enterprise grows, so does the gates of her house. So she is never encouraged to seek productivity outside of the house. She can be successful. She can be a successful businesswoman, but her success should never make her house a hindrance, right? She should always be available for her husband and her children. That's kind of the idea. The men are the ones who should be ready to give their lives for their house, right? And nowadays we have a very truncated idea of household. Nowadays we think of household as 3 kids, 2 wives. 3 kids, 1 wife, one husband. Back then, here's Abraham's household. Abraham's household goes to war against 9 nations, right? My bad, Chincha. Yeah, so nowadays it's 2 parents, 3 children. That's kind of nuclear family, whatever. Back then, Abraham's household went to war against 9 nations. That's how truncated nowadays household is, right? But I do think it is a product of taking productivity out of the home. And that's why I would encourage people to have some kind of home enterprise, suggestively. People nowadays are obsessed with finding the right one. So that's an interesting doctrine. Don't be surprised, right? You watch rom-coms, right? You watch romantic comedies, you watch all these basically nowadays shows that says that there is the one, right? There's a right one out there. And Christians would take that and go, oh yeah, God is sovereign. God did determine with me the one. But the problem is they take that far and long and say, God, I need to know your secret will. Who's the one that you have for me? Right? I'm going to flip this coin. I'm going to pray for a rainbow. I'm going to, like John did just now. So I'm going to pray for a rainbow. I want to see 2 lightning storms and an E5 tornado. Then I'm going to marry Susie, God's will. Right? But that's stupid, because nowhere in the Bible are you told to seek God's secret will, right? If both Susie and Emily are God-fearing women for a man, then guess what? Both of them can be God's will. The only question is, well, which one is truly God's will? You can only find out if you actually try by, trying to court, trying to arrange a marriage with them, a future with them, and whatnot. But it's not, it's not the kind of, rom-com kind of, oh, I run to someone in the corridor, I spilled his coffee everywhere, and he's the one, right? Here's Mr. Handsome CEO, shrugged him off, spilled his coffee everywhere. He's the one. Right there, he's the one. Because we locked eyes and some weird cheesy music came up, right? So, and interestingly enough, usually it would be Susie's God's will, and I always say it that way because she is suddenly the will of God for more than one guys, right? So 5 guys suddenly come up, they all go, I think she's the one, I think she's the one. The pastor goes and listens to all 5 of them, and they go, oh no, what did I just run into? She's now the will of God for 5 different men. So that's also a problem. But yeah, that generally it's unbiblical. So don't fall for that kind of notion.
I'll just add that if anything, the church should be encouraging early marriages and helping out in whatever
The
capacity
church
they
should
can.
help out, right?
Yeah.
In that the church should cultivate godly women, the church should cultivate brave men, and eventually, naturally, things will play out.
Yeah.
Right? You're doing ministry together, you're worshiping together. How hard is it to build a household within God's household?
I mean, it's kind of funny. It is kind of it's kind of funny when you think about it. Why should early marriage be encouraged? Well, for one thing, for those who are dating and so on, do you think they necessarily can stay pure that long? To my knowledge, a lot of
Right.
people kind of just lax after a pretty early point.
Right.
Don't get me
Again,
wrong. I'm no dating expert, and I've never even had a dating experience in my life.
Hey,
But-
let the married man speak.
I'll toss that. I'll let the married man speak in this case.
You guys are speaking theory. I'll speak from experience. I tell you, if you see that the problem is when you want the pie and you want to eat it, but yet you don't get married. That's messed up. That's selfish, and that is immature.
Man.
I mean, I think the thing about dating, you want to date like super young, like nowadays, even like primary school kids say I want to date. They don't even know what is and they say they want to date someone, they want to, marry the other person. But I think the problem is always, too much TV, and they get all this, like you say, the romance and all this thing, and too much porn as well. I agree on that. Too much porn, too much of this kind of garbage, and then people want to try it out, but it's just basically lust. Let's admit it. Let's get out of system. You are just biologically do stuff, and you want to try it out on somebody, and then you call that dating. And then people are starting very young. They want to date because they just want to try it out, but they don't want to get married.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Wait, she's lagging. She's lagging.
no.
Oh, Mau. Lagging.
Okay, join a bit laggy.
So Joe lag. Coco right now. Oh man.
Junjung, you're lagging quite a bit.
You're lagging a lot. Hello, Joe. If you want to, you can type it out. It's quite sad right now. That
Yeah,
was quite
but
fire though.
but it's okay. And I think the general point is caught, right? Paul says, it's better to marry than burn with passion. That it's kind of inferred from that it's better to get married, and if anything, get married soon rather than swim with your passion and
So
whatever.
yeah, Mingron,
Like Chun
that's
said, most people want the pie. Yeah.
Yeah.
People want the pie, they don't want to eat it. That's what happens when you separate the responsibility from the consequence. According to biblical law, anyone who wants to have sex with a woman, the guy must pay the dowry for her, right? If a man has sex with a woman, he must pay the full dowry for her in marriage or out of marriage. So, in a sense, the Bible says you can't do anything with her until you get married, right? In a very real sense. If you know that meme, you don't get to hold hands until you're married. It's almost true in a sense, but not that,
you almost don't get
not to extreme degrees. But yeah, biblically, pay your dowry, right? Be ready for whatever comes your way, and you don't get to have your pie and eat it too. So,
But yeah, early marriage doesn't mean early relationship. It doesn't.
Yeah.
so I think the
Sorry,
time.
got disconnected just now.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah.
We get the idea though. So the time is 9:55 for you guys. I think John, you can